This week I received a letter from the bishop that was sent through Father Luke Ferris, who's our Vicar General, concerning the year of St. Joseph. 2020 marks the 150th anniversary, and again I wrote this in the article in the bulletin too if you want to take another reference or look at it. 2020 marks the 150th anniversary of Pius IX, I believe, was declared Joseph the patron of the church. In other words, the protector of the church. I believe it was in 1968 that Joseph's name was added to the Roman canon, the Eucharistic prayer we say that we know as the first Eucharistic prayer. Before that, it was never added. Pope Francis in 2017, I believe, added St. Joseph to the Roman canon, to all the, not the Roman canon, but all the other Eucharistic prayers. So if you look even at the book that I read from at the Mass or during the consecration, St. Joseph's name is not in there. I have to actually add it. They came out with new editions of the Missal, but I didn't want to spend the money just to add St. Joseph. So just being a good steward of all your gifts. So I would like to encourage, just as I begin this homily, for all the men, especially in the parish, to make a consecration this year to St. Joseph. I have made the consecration to Mary several times, but the consecration to Joseph is very little known. And the reason why is because Joseph is known as a silent saint. If you read the scriptures, he never is quoted saying anything. I often invoke his intercession when I think that I'm saying too much, which is a lot. But St. Joseph, as a protector of the church, gives us a great example of what it means to be a husband and a father, and somebody who walks very simply and closely with the Lord in his life, and very quietly. And so I want to recommend March 30th as a date. That's the end of next month. I know tomorrow we're at March 1st already. Because that will, in 33 days, line us up perfectly with the day of May 1st. And May 1st is the day of Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. So St. Joseph the Worker. So with the combination of that ends on a Friday. I'd like to say a Mass that night for all those who can attend that are making the consecration. And I'd also like to offer that day, I'm going to free myself up that day, that anybody that wants businesses blessed or anything like that, because it's the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker, they can do that. I'll also have holy water bottles available if anyone wants to do that. Again, women are welcome to make the consecration too. I think it would be great for them to do too. But I just want to really encourage the men especially to do it as we look for a great example in St. Joseph of what it means to be husbands and fathers and men after the Lord's heart. And so today, real quickly, I want to go through our readings because they're of the utmost importance, because they tell us fundamentally two things: who we are in relationship to God and what's missing in the world. Who we are and what's missing in the world. Our first reading is from the book of Genesis, and again, it's a foundational text for the rest of what happens in the Bible and foundational for understanding anything. The news we watch, the newspapers we read, the magazines we look at, it's an interpretive key for almost all of it, even the small things that happen in our life. And in it we read about God forming man in his own image and likeness in the beginning in the Garden of Eden, and very quickly it moves into chapter 3 to talk about the fall. And something that I always like to point out in this particular text is the fact that when the devil tempts in the form of a serpent, tempts Eve in that garden, he says, God said, if you eat of that tree, you will die. And the devil said, no, if you eat of the tree, you will live. God knows, he told Eve, if you eat of the tree, you're actually going to be like God. Your eyes will be opened. And you will be living. And Eve says, no, God told us on the day we ate it, we would die. And so then as we read on, we hear that Eve did in fact follow the devil's temptation, that serpent's temptation. She eats the apple, and then what happens? She doesn't die. Do you notice that, how she doesn't die? It's confusing. If God said the day you eat it, you will die, and she doesn't, the devil says the day you eat it, you'll be alive, your eyes will be open. She recognized things, and with Adam and Eve recognized things in their life after they ate of that apple that they didn't notice before. In fact, it says that they were ashamed because they were naked. They were naked before, but something new was introduced to them. And so it sounds like in the gospel or in the reading from Genesis today that in fact God is the one that's lying, and the one that is known in the Bible as the father of lies, the accuser, is the one who's telling the truth. So either the person who wrote this text is speaking wrongly, which of course we don't believe he is, because God is the father of all truth. He is truth itself. The devil is the father of lies. Unless we're meant, of course, through the author to see something much deeper in here. The truth is that Adam and Eve lost something more important than their life immediately. They would lose it eventually. But what the author means us to see is that they lost their identity in God. They lost their relationship with God. They no longer knew who they were. They no longer had limits or boundaries to what the understanding of their relationship was. And that shame that they experienced was a shame because they saw each other not as somebody identified in relationship with God, but they saw somebody standing across from them that somebody could be used maybe for their own purposes. There was a transgression. We call it concupiscence, or we would call it sin, that entered the world, giving us a vision of the world that takes things out of context, that tends to overreach for things that aren't God. They tend to make us look at each other as things to be used, people to be used, rather than creatures loved by God. You know, it was interesting, this weekend we were doing the Stations of the Cross with the little ones in the school, and as I was going through the stations, we're following Jesus along the Stations of the Cross, and I was just kind of wondering how many of our little ones would really understand what they're doing in following Jesus and seeing the face of a human man going through the Stations of the Cross and his abuse and crucifixion and that. And it dawned on me that maybe I should tell them, you know, Jesus is the lamb. So when you see Jesus, this human being going through this stuff, imagine that it's an innocent lamb. And I started thinking to myself, well, why would I say that? Why would I sense that? Well, mostly because I think in general we have a sense that animals ought to be more protected even than human beings. And that somehow through our culture there's been this sort of twisting in the brain a little bit of cultural influences of our minds to think that, you know, human beings, yeah, that's just what they go through, but we would never let an animal go through that. See, it's close to the truth. Well, I've got nothing, I'm not for torturing or killing animals, unless they're on my plate, I suppose. But the idea is that certainly not for cruelty's sake, of course not. But there's that disconnect there. There's something missing. And so when we advance to our gospel today, friends, we find again somebody that's not in a garden. We find Jesus through the disobedience of Adam and Eve. We find somebody that is going to take their place in Jesus who goes out into the desert. Where Adam and Eve were surrounded by a lush and beautiful green garden, we find in perfect relationship to God, we find Jesus going into the starkness of the desert, perfectly understanding who he is in relationship to God and undergoing temptation of the evil one again. But this time, he holds on to his identity. The first attack always on humanity from evil is always an attack on identity. Who are you? If you are the Son of God, then turn these stones into loaves of bread. If you have that power, if you really are, the implicit thing in there in Greek is that the devil really believes that he is and can do that. Could he? Yes. But he's not going to show off. Jesus is always about self-giving. He's never about self-receiving. And the next temptation, the same thing. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself from this precipice, from this parapet of the temple. And the angels will guard you. And then the last one, he doesn't say you are the Son of God, he just really ramps it up and he says, you know what, I know you're the Son of God, you know your identity, but guess what? Disown God as your Father and claim me. And Jesus says very simply, no. And the conclusion in that gospel is that angels come to minister to him. The central point, of course, in our first and our last, and the reading in the gospel is St. Paul telling us, St. Paul gets really confusing. So if you were following along with that reading, you probably shut the book and shook your head and thought, I have no idea what's going on there. St. Paul is simply saying this: through the disobedience of Adam and Eve, the disobedience of one man, Adam, came sin into the world. Now, oftentimes people will say, just because Adam screwed up, why do I have to suffer for that? Right? Legitimately so. You can ask that question. But then we have to further that question through the redemption of Jesus dying for our sins and giving us access to that identity and that relationship with God again. How is it fair then that we can participate in the suffering of Jesus? It wouldn't be fair if you're going to use that principle. It's not fair that one should die for all. But that's exactly what happened. Friends, the first temptation of the evil one is always a temptation to break us from our identity and our relationship from God. And he uses subtle lies. I think one of the biggest lies that most people suffer, whether they know it or not, is that the devil can say to us, if you indeed are a son or daughter of God, beloved by him, then why did your child die? If you are a beloved son and daughter of God, then why was your father killed in a car accident? If you believe that you are a beloved son and daughter of God, then what happened to your marriage? You see where I'm going with this. And as soon as we start to buy the lie of that identity, again, the devil uses those things, those suffering in life, to sort of twist the knife. And our response so often to him, as many in our culture have responded, is to simply walk away from their identity in God because they forget about the big picture that God has called us to a life beyond this one. Rejection of the lies of evil are the first step to recovering our identity. A few weeks ago, I took a kind of vow, I guess. I don't know if I really lose my patience a lot. I guess I feel like I do. But about 3 weeks ago, I said, you know what? I'm never going to lose my patience again. I quit. I'm just not going to do it. And the assaults came. Well, nothing worked right. Miscommunication, that whole thing, it was just abounding. And as long as I forgot that vow, I would start falling into that little temptation. But when I remembered it, I would say, no, I will not. Because I know that I'm a beloved son of God, and there's something more important going on here. And that I might be suffering for my family, my parishioners, whatever else it is, these little difficulties that I may suffer, that I'm doing it for a greater purpose, and although I don't know it now, it will eventually be revealed to me. Do you reject Satan? I do. And all his empty works? I do. And all his empty promises? I do. And friends, they are empty. They are empty. And so this weekend, friends, as we begin Lent and this campaign of fasting and prayer and almsgiving, let's recover our identity and who we are. You know when you watch the news, people self-identifying, the language that they're using there is precisely what I'm talking about. That if you have an identity that you give yourself or that somebody else gives you, you're falling short of your true identity in God as a beloved son and daughter. Let God identify you. Let him speak to you, just as he did to Jesus as he was baptized right before the gospel today. And no matter what comes in your life in that testing, whether it be your own sinfulness, the sinfulness of somebody else, hold firm on your identity. And I just want to leave you with this saying that I heard several years ago. To remember as we make it through this again, this time of Lent, we come face to face with our own sinfulness and attacks on our own identity and those times that we may have bought into those lies. To remember that the devil knows your name but he calls you by your sin. God knows your sin, but in wanting to forgive you, always calls you by your name.